Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
One of the key elements is accepting and understanding that you cannot be everywhere, and that the main job of a leader of any kind is to be a hub of information and be able to get a lot of information, process it very quickly, and then relay it to the right stakeholders in time, right? Either curate it, transform it, and then be able to get things in movement. And that is a very different skill than the technology decision process.
Welcome to a new episode of Engines of Creation. I'm your host, Cristian Mastrodonato. Today, we're meeting with Sergio Gago, currently CTO at Cloudera, as he shares his journey from engineer to technology leader. With a rich background in technology, Sergio reflects on his evolution in the tech landscape, emphasizing the importance of problem solving and the creative potential of coding. We delve into his recently published book, The CTO Toolbox, where he outlines essential skills and knowledge required to excel in the CTO role. Sergio discusses the challenges of transitioning from a technical to a leadership position, highlighting the need for effective communication and the ability to manage complexity within organizations. The conversation also touches on the impact of generative AI on the tech industry, exploring how it enhances decision-making and communication. Finally, Sergio passionately discusses the future of quantum computing, its potential to revolutionize various fields, and the importance of curiosity and passion in driving technology innovation. Please don't forget to follow Engines of Creation and leave us a rating and a review. And don't hesitate to share this episode on social media and with friends and colleagues who might be interested. This podcast counts on you to grow and help other people to understand and embrace complexity to innovate and create. And now, let's go! It's great to have you here, Sergio. I'm sure this is going to be a great conversation and we're going to dive down in a lot of interesting topics. So I think we can start from knowing a little bit more about you in general for the guests who don't know you yet. So can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about you?
Absolutely. And thank you very much for having me here today, Christian. It was long due. We've been talking about this moment for a long time. So really happy to be part of your show today. So my name is Sergio. I am a Spaniard Chief Technology Officer who started his career as an engineer. So I started coding and I spent a good part of my early working years in programming pretty much every programming language, the good and the bad, the nice and the uglies, and trying to use coding to craft things. At the end of the day, I like to think that we engineers are problem solvers and use code as little pieces of Lego, if you will, to create things, right? Even poetry. Of course, now this is changing a little bit with AI and coding assistants, but that's what moved me all the way to get into technology leadership roles, into eventually CTO, Chief Technology Officer, and then moving into big data, back in the day, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and in the last few years into quantum computing. So I'm getting into the deeper and deeper tech side of the world. I don't know if there is any end to that.
Thanks a lot. You mentioned already a lot of interesting things that hopefully we're going to dive down later on, but I would actually like to start from the craft. And you mentioned starting from an engineer, and you mentioned, of course, being a CTO in startups and large organizations. And I know you have actually written a book, CTO Toolbox, about your craft and how to do your craft. And so I think, at least for me as a practitioner, I think it would be very interesting to understand a little more from you of what's in this toolbox, what you need to know and what you need to do to be a good CTO.
Absolutely. And that was indeed one of the reasons why I decided to write all this. So typically, CTOs become CTOs through the technical path. In some cases, you can become one through the business path. And then you have some advantages on one side and some disadvantages on the other, right? But many of us start from the trenches of coding. And, we engineers, we like to be very focused on the code. We tend to be pragmatic. We tend to be realists. And we tend to think that what we do is deterministic, right? If something in my software doesn't work, it's because I made a mistake. As you grow in your career and you decide to move into management, you suddenly realize that things are not deterministic anymore. And now you're dealing with and all the complexities that teams, big and small, and companies and politics and investments and finance and so on has. So typically the CTO has to transform itself completely into that type of role. For many people, and this was especially true in the old days, when you were an engineer, the only way to grow in your career was to become a manager, maybe a project manager, maybe a director, and so on. Nowadays, that is not necessarily true anymore in many companies. Now you can be a staff engineer, a fellow, you can be an individual contributor, very senior on your craft, and still keep growing and making good money. And that's a good thing. But back in the day, that was not that common. You had to go into, go and meet clients and do sales and become a manager and eventually become a director of engineering, senior director of engineering, VP, or CTO, which was my case. Now, the problem is no one really teaches you how to make this jump because it's not just the next step in the ladder. It's a completely different horizontal change. The trade is even opposite in some cases, right? And the other challenge is that if you grow within your company, suddenly you've moved from being one more in the team to be the boss, the one who does the performance reviews, the ones that balances the salaries, the one who decides who to hire, and so on. You can be very good friends with your team, but you're still the boss to some extent. And of course, this changes a lot by cultures and so on. But there is a big, big difference. When you look at at a leadership team in a company, all these C-level executives, right? From the CEO to the chief marketing officer, sales, revenue, product, and so on. Most of them have really good business acumen that was required in order to get into that role. Maybe some have their MBAs or their other masters in senior executive roles. They've been growing with that business acumen. Whereas in technology, that is not necessarily the case. Typically, we reach this point because we have been good at building things, at coordinating teams, at managing complexity in software systems and so on. But suddenly we are completely out of our place. How do we get a seat at the table? And by this, I mean, how do we play in the same level field as the other C-level executives? We are treated as equals, of course, experts in technology, but at the same time with the same weight, or if not more, if we are in a technology company or in a digital company and so on. So this is something that typically CTOs have to learn by doing and by making tons of mistakes. There's a really good analogy on the sizes of CTOs, because the other challenge is that there's as many definitions as chief technology officers as companies out there. You can be the co-founder of a startup with 3 people and you're the CTO, sure, but do you do everything technology-wise? Are you really the CTO? All the way to a company that grows, maybe you have 20 engineers, maybe 50 at some point, 100 or a couple hundred, and at some point 1,000 or something like that. It's almost like being the CTO of your house, of your apartment building, of your neighborhood, of your city, and of your country. And each of those jumps is, again, a completely different game, a completely different job, right? So with all those challenges, and because tech people tend to focus usually on the tech stuff, that is our safe bet, right? We join a company and we start looking at everything. How is the cloud structure here? How is the architecture defined? What is our technical depth? Well, that is good and fine, but because that is what we usually know how to do. What about people management, coordination with your C-level executives, finance and accounting and budgeting, and so on and so forth, right? Sales and understanding what are we building and why and what our competitors are doing. So because all those things have to be learned by doing, then I decided, what if I take some of those pills of the successes and mistakes that I've made in 20 plus years of leading technical teams, and I put them in a book where I divide those concepts between how to build software, how to build products, how to deal with corporates, how to take care of yourself, how to sell a company when you are into an M&A process, into a due diligence process, and so on. And with a few colleagues as well that are experts in their own fields and have been guest writers in the book, we put together this little book that we call the CTO Toolbox, which is pretty much everything I would have loved to know the first time I took the leap of faith and took one of these CTO positions, regardless of the size of the company. And then we also decided to donate all the proceeds from the book to a couple of really, really nice NGOs. If you allow me to give them a shout out here. One is teaming.net, which is a really, really nice NGO in Barcelona. It's a marketplace of projects, of solidarity projects. And another one is Migracode Barcelona as well, who helps migrants and people in not very good situations to learn and upskill their careers and become tech people. So it has been really good. It has been selling pretty good. Got a lot of positive reviews and feedback. And I don't know, maybe at some point a second edition on what are the next learnings. But even writing the book helped me put in order a lot of those ideas that usually you have and are part of your, I don't know, your leadership mantra. How you deal with yourself, how you deal with your first 90 days as a CXO in a company. So even the fact of writing was a really helpful exercise to do and put all this together for the community.
That's fascinating. And of course, also it's beautiful that you're also donating all the proceeding on the book. But yeah, but also nice to follow your thought process and the history behind that. And one of the things that I resonated with me also, which I definitely found myself in the past, is like also having a toolbox or tools to take care of yourself, something that you need to grow, because of course, the more responsibilities you have, the more you need to take care of yourself. Otherwise, it's easy to get dragged into the all the difficulties and issues that you might have with that role, of course, together with all the interesting learnings you might have. You touched earlier around managing complexity, and I really, as you know, this is sort of the strap line of this podcast, and I think it is a key element, especially when you mention of there is an element of technical complexity, which you usually deal when you do the engineering career, which is usually the one that goes up and up and up, sort of for the engineer, for any sort of engineering leadership. But when you go into CTO role, you actually enter into the business, and there are so many dimensions, and it's so that becomes a multi-dimensional problem. It's not just technology,
exactly.
It's people, and it's business and ROI and so forth. So what are for you the key element there for managing complexity when really you enter into that role and you have to suddenly take into account so many different dimensions? What are the key elements for you that you have to take, or the key parameters we might call them, that you want to sort of take into account and start looking into those?
Yeah, I think one of the key elements is accepting and understanding that you cannot be everywhere, and that the main job of a leader of any kind is to be a hub of information and be able to get a lot of information, process it very quickly, and then relay it to the right stakeholders in time, right? Either curate it, transform it, and then be able to get things in movement. And that is a very different skill than the technology decision process. Like I love designing architectures for building complex systems. That's sort of playing with the puzzle. But when you're a C-level executive, regardless on being in technology or anything else, you're not putting the puzzle together. You're effectively designing it. And that's a completely different way of thinking about the process, right? I think that the second element is that when we become CTOs or CXOs of any kind, we keep saying, if I ask CTOs all around the question, who are your team members? Who is your team? They would say, oh, look, I have a couple of VPs, I have a few directors of engineering, and I have a team of 100 engineers or 50 or 5 engineers. And while that is true, it's not necessarily the reality of companies. And not many people say, no, my team is the other C-level executives. the chief marketing officer, the chief sales officer, the chief product officer. That should be two hands together of the same coin, specifically and especially in a technology company, right? So many people don't embrace the fact that now you have a seat at the table, and your team is the team that does the complexity management for the whole company with the different specializations, right? You have, of course, a group of humans working with you to build the stuff in the same way that a CPO would have a group of humans designing what to build. But the team that is putting all that together are the senior executive team or the C-suite or any way you want to call it. The third element, I think, is how technology related to technology itself, how technology evolves into continuous entropy. So we like to make things complex and try to see the future and try to see how everything changes, which is the biggest enemy of complex system management, right? Is how do we, from a higher, more strategic view and long term, see how our industry, our products, the ecosystem we live in, how is that evolving, and how do we keep that entropy manageable? In some cases, we do it very well, typically when we talk about technical debt, for example, and because that is our bread and butter, but it's not the only angle or dimension, as you were saying before. There are many, many more angles. What's the cash flow of the company and the situation? How do we hire? Where do we hire? Where do we have new development hubs for the company and so on? So there are thousands of questions that you have to ask yourself and the CEO and the rest of your peers continuously to tame that complexity, and then be the counter argument to your team. And I'll give you another example: a buy versus build conversation, right? Very typical and common in engineering teams, where we engineers, we tend to like building things, but in a world of ever increasing complexity, building things typically comes with a lot of debt that we accrue, especially if there are things on the shelf that we can engage with and so on. So it's our job to try to minimize that entropy or that complexity to the minimum. And sometimes that means having to make unpopular decisions with the team, if that makes sense. And that's something that I like to touch on the book as well. Like, how do you make difficult decisions that lead to what I call the loneliness of the CTO? And this is a very tricky thing, because on the executive team, usually the CTO is the only one, or should be the only one, that has both the technical and the business expertise. Sure, the other team members have very specific domain expertise on their areas, but if you are on a technology company, you have a very unique point of view on what are the capital investments that you have to make or want to make on a given technology, a refactor, new architecture, new product, and so on. One of the points I like to make always, and I know it's sometimes contested and tricky, and I make it on the book, is the technical debt. Technical debt starts with the CFO, and everyone starts shouting out loud and saying, "Well, what do you mean? Technical debt is a technical concept and is a CTO responsibility and the engineering team responsibility." Yes, but in the moment you start looking at technical debt, which is in a way a measure of how complexity goes out of control on the software base of your company. If you start looking at it from the angle of debt rather than technical, then when you want to sell the company the need to do a refactor, put more focus and an emphasis on quality assurance or reviewing the security procedures and so on, now you're not a technical guy bubbling about why the system is slow or anything like that. Now you're talking in the language that the rest of your C-level peers speak, which is money. The reason of calling it technical debt was indeed to try to make a simile with actual debt, right? As you get into you make specific decisions that were made for a very good reason, usually back in the day, and that means that you have to repay those decisions with a principal and with some interest. You can repay that, basically paying your interest month over month in terms of tickets, story points, or bug fixes, and so on. But you can also repay the principal when you decide to say, refactor a whole component from your platform, or deprecate a whole new functionality or a product that is seldom being used. When you use these terms, then suddenly it becomes something that the CFO can understand, can put on the books in the same way that normal financial debt. So you see, again, is can we speak the same language? Can we make decisions comparing apples with apples? And then can we tame complexity and communicate at the different levels of the organization?
That's very powerful, and this connection, of course, between the technical debt and financial debt is very true, and I have in mind a lot of examples of that, so I can resonate. If I might, I'd like to hear your opinion on another, let's call it buzzword sometime, definitely in
Sure.
let's say technology organization, which is Conway's law, and the connection, which is, I personally really see the connection between your technology architecture and your actually organizational architecture, and which might be more, we might argue that might be closer to the chief people officer, let's say, or your relationship of the chief people officers instead of the chief financial officer. So what's the take on that side, on really how you match the, let's say, the technical approach and the technical vision versus the organization? Especially, I would argue for a CTO in a scaling situation, it's also something that you have to constantly reassess, because you made example earlier. Okay, it's a different situation when you are in 3, and as a CTO, you're actually doing everything. And when you are in 300, that's a completely different sort of ballpark. So yeah, how do you see this noise law application in the CTO's job?
I am a firm believer that Conway's law always apply one way or another. Always applies. So for your listeners, basically the shape and your organizational design is going to define the architecture, the software architectures that you build, right? So if you're a very distributed organization with lots of pockets, you may end up with microservices and so on. If you have other type of organization, you may have a monolith and whatnot. But that is not the only factor. You mentioned your relationship with the chief people officer and the organizational design of your company and the CEO. Is your company more consensus driven or is more authoritarian, for example? What is the general culture of the company? In the past, we had companies used to be much more local. So you had Spanish companies, British companies, American companies with a very specific ethos based on the ethos of that specific culture, right? We know that there are cultures that are more afraid of uncertainty or afraid of failure. And there are cultures that are more aggressive in communication or more conservative in communication. And that's a normal thing. It's just how different people in country work. And you start realizing that when you work with a lot of people internationally, right? There's a really good index that measures that. It's called Hofstede's index, and measures different dimensions of different countries on how we are open to failure, for example, how we are more communal and collective on our decision making, or how are we more meritocratic, for example. So that's another dimension that adds into the mix. The more meritocratic a company is, the less of Peter's principle you will have. Peter's principle also works in here, as someone grows until their point of mediocrity. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Some people take Peter's principle as opposed to explosion. The way I look at this is back into the point I was making earlier, when we engineers had to become managers in order to make more money. I'm sure many listeners have seen this situation where you have this rock star engineer, really good person, amazing coder, and then you say, hey, this person is so good that we want to put him or her in front of clients. And then the person sucks terribly at it, right? And you try to promote that person, giving him or her a favor and the company and so on. And what you did was two mistakes. You lost a great engineer and you won a terrible manager or a terrible pre-sales engineer or anything you call it. So that's another factor that adds into the mix. And probably the last one is how you as a CTO can adapt yourself to the changes of the organization. So are you still hands-on when you shouldn't? Are you communicating enough? Are you putting the right channels so that people can share that information across the company? Once you have something like 50, 100 people in your team, as a CTO, but as a C-level exec, it doesn't really matter. If you're not spending the most part of your day communicating, talking, and saying the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, whether it is the guiding principles of the team, the vision of the company, the goals for the quarter of the year, trying to be this hub that receives information and shares it with other people in a curated way, then you are not doing your job. I've met CTOs who are still on the daily stand-ups of 10 different Scrum teams. It's like, what are you doing? Why would you do this? Let them do their job. You hire good people so that they can make these decisions, right? But give them the right tools for that. Give them the right information in a timely manner. Give them the right advice, if you will. Give them the right mentorship and communicate early and often. So all those things I think can counter a little bit Conway's law. We have tons of examples on how this works, the Amazon principles of working and so on, how technology now helps with all those things. And now, of course, the world is changing completely with coding assistants, AI, and so on. So there is already a new reality with vibe coding and so on. So what a time to be alive.
Absolutely. I love, of course, where you ended up, because I was actually thinking a lot about AI while we were talking. And from my perspective, what I was really thinking would be the two major elements we discussed so far. Okay, on the one hand, let's call it the tech depth conversation you mentioned, and now discussed about sort of the organizational structure. Of course, joking around Conway's law and Peter's principle. Key element I heard from you is communication. Is really the language you choose, the word you use to describe things, and the way you can communicate either with the rest of the business. So being able to communicate technology versus finance versus product versus anyone else. And on the other hand, being able to communicate to your own technology team whatever is going on. And communication is key. And now we have this new mind-blowing technology in our hands that basically it completely changes the game when it comes to communication. And literally anything that is content, well, now we can basically, well, it is fair to say it's even beyond that. Anything that can be tokenized, you can do stuff on that going into biology. But let's not look at that. Let's focus more on the words, tokens as words. This is changing. This is changing everything. You mentioned in code, but you mentioned even in creating content, in being able to communicate to multiple people. So yeah, what's your take? What's gonna happen? What's the future here with all these generative AI revolution?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know where all this is going to end. I wish I knew. I think I am the first one embracing this, not only from the tactical perspective on how it is impacting our jobs and also the communication element, but I think it is definitely helping our job massively. I believe I am now at least twice as effective as I was 2 years ago, thanks to using this technology. But when we talk about communication, I think it was Reid Hoffman who said that when your tongue is falling out of your mouth by repeating the same thing over and over again is when people start understanding it. So communication is using the right words, using the right tone, the right ethos, pathos, and logos with the right group. Job number one for a CTO, you're talking to the board, you're talking to the investors, you're talking to your team members, you're talking to the whole population of the company. How do you tweak that for the right audience? As communication is also about leading. It's about convincing. So sure, I can use ChatGPT or any other system to craft for me a nice end of year, I don't know, speech or something. Sure, maybe it can help me write better sentences in English since I am not native, and it will help me do all this much quicker. But if I have to convince my team why we need to go the extra mile, because otherwise we're not going to get to the revenue number that we will need to get the next funding round or the debt that we have to repay, and otherwise we're all going to be out of a job. That is human leadership. That is basically harnessing the troops, gathering the troops, getting everyone looking into the same direction and saying, let's bloody go to make this happen. I haven't seen yet an AI that leads me. It is helping me lead, it is helping me motivate, convince people, and so on. But I chose a job because of the manager I'm going to have, because I believe I'm aligned with the values of the company I'm going to work with or what this company is trying to achieve. And all those are human values. So for me, those are always Jiminy Crickets in our shoulder, helping us do things that otherwise we would have taken hours, days, weeks. They give us superpowers, but especially for managers, man, we are convincing people continuously, and we have ownership, which is another point I didn't mention before. We have to make decisions based on very limited amount of information. That's what divides one good manager from another. You try to get as much data as you can, and then with that you make a decision. Maybe you make that decision with a group of people, maybe you make that decision yourself. But it seldom happens that you have all the information available, or even 90% or 80%. Sometimes you have to make a decision with only a few data points. That means that you own the success or the massive failure of that decision, and you have to live with, right? That's the burden and the responsibility. And that's why we're paid more, right? For having to make those decisions. The same applies to any C-level, obviously to the CEO of the company and the investors and so on, everyone with a responsibility. So it all goes towards the concept of extreme ownership and truly owning the decisions that you make. Now, if in a given situation, I was able to gather 40% of the available data points in order to make a decision and consolidate all that, and because of the time available, resources, and so on, that's all I could get. Now, I can probably go all the way to 70% of the information available. So I make decisions better. I make decisions faster. I'm made the deeper connections or implications of my decisions. And because of that, I want to think I am a better professional, if that makes sense.
I love that. And I love the way you move the conversation from AI back to humans. You also answered a lot of concerns about people around AI is going to take over humans, or in our work, AI is going to take over developers, AI is going to take over sort of management jobs. And the reality is there is these decision-making elements. There is this ownership element that, very unlikely a machine is going to replace you.
Let me give you an example. As a CTO, no matter how big or small my team was, I always tried to find at least a morning per week to keep coding. Maybe just a side project, maybe just a fun thing, but something that helps me continuously educating myself on new technologies, new languages, the state of the art, and it doesn't have to be something productive. My teams usually don't want my code in any commit, and with good reason. But being technical is a fundamental skill that the CTO needs to have in order to build rapport, right? To build this trust with your team members. You're speaking the same language. So I always try to find a full week of coding for whatever it is. And in the last year or so, I haven't typed a single line of code myself anymore. At the beginning, I tried to force myself to use coding assistants. I went from GitHub Copilot, Cursor, and many others, Replit. Now my weapon of choice is Cursor AI with NCP and all these new goodies. I haven't typed a single line of code in a little bit less than a year, yet I have produced more code than ever before in that amount of time. Yet the systems that I build are following my various exact specifications. I am designing, I am in control, and I am accepting sometimes feedback from the system saying, what are you talking about? This doesn't make sense. Would you like me to do it like this or like that? Have you thought about this feature? Have you thought about implementing this feature in this other way or with this other library? And I say, yeah, that's actually a good idea and it makes sense. In the same way that if we were teammates coding something together, you would come to me and say, hey, Sergio, the way you're coding this doesn't make sense. Why don't you use, I don't know, a recursive algorithm here? And I would say, you're right. Thanks for the note, right? So it's amazing stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's extremely fascinating the way these things are taking over. Yeah, and a very similar experience with you. It's definitely, I'm a horrible coder nowadays, but I don't have to anymore. There is Copilot and there are all these tools, Cursor, and lately I was playing a little with Lovable that actually,
Yes.
it's actually quite lovable. And so these are all interesting. This is definitely the direction of travel, and I found it so fascinating. So, okay, we've been talking about AI, and we've been talking about the way it's impacting our lives. And now I'm gonna move out of AI, and I'm gonna move down into a deep tech topic that you mentioned already. I know you love very much, and we share this love for different reasons. In the sense, actually, you started as an engineer. I actually started sort of in quantum physics. And even though I have to admit, you know way more about quantum things than I do, but yes, quantum computing. So I hear people say, "Oh, it's the next revolution," and the next thing coming after AI. And I always think, well, it's kind of a different thing altogether in many ways. I'm curious to see I'm curious to hear where your passion for quantum computing came from, and where do you think we are heading towards in that field?
That's one of my favorite topics ever. I'll try to not keep your podcast live for 5 hours talking about quantum because it could easily happen. But it all boils down to what I think is one of the most important traits of a technologist, which is passion and curiosity. When I'm hiring engineers or researchers of any kind, those are the things I try to look for, right? How curious. Are you testing a new LLM that was dropped just 6 hours ago and seeing how good or bad it's performing and what things can you build with it? All the way to what is the new deep tech element that has a promise to do something that before we couldn't even dream of, right? So my path into quantum started way before generative AI. In fact, I was a little bit bored with the world of machine learning because it was kind of the same. It was a big data. You should remember the big data hype 10 years, 15 years ago. So it was kind of the same. Back then, I sold my company and I was thinking, what should I do next? Do I take a sabbatical? Do I do something? And then I decided to go into a biocomputing. Enroll in the Masters of Biocomputing and see how can, computer science and the things that we know can certainly help a lot with either chemistry, drug discovery, and so on, or even new treatments that are CRISPR stuff and whatnot. And then I learned two things in that program. One was that quantum computers actually existed, and two, that computer scientists were like the lab assistants of the biologists. The smart people in biocomputing are the biologists. We're the ones at the end of the paper, so to say, which makes sense, right? We're kind of looking into patterns on the genome sequences and whatnot, and trying to build these systems for the biologists to run their experiments and all that stuff. But I remember very clearly one session where we had to do some specific distillation on a genome sequence, and the professor said, "Well, this is an NP-hard problem. The longer the genome sequence grows, the exponentially more complex the problem is to solve. However, there's a company already putting together a quantum computer that is promising that in the future this will be solvable exponentially faster." And then two things clicked in my head. Like, all right, what are you talking about? For me, quantum computing was like a dream from the 90s, a reach refinement dream. But I didn't know that the industry had evolved. All right, this was about 5-6 years ago. So I did the biocomputing masters and I opened Pandora's box and got deep into quantum, then switched into a master's in quantum information and realized that quantum computing, again, this was about six years ago, was going to be the absolute future of how we do computations in the world. For the ones who haven't heard much of it, it's a new type of computer, right? It's a new type of chip that helps with very specific types of problems. It's not a general purpose device. You will still play video games or open your Excel on your normal laptop, but a lot of the mathematical problems underlying the complexity of our world, whether it is optimizing financial portfolios, analyzing credit risk, doing drug discovery, or new chemicals, new materials, optimizing batteries, optimizing solar panels, trying to get into nuclear fusion, optimizing your logistics routes or shipping lanes. A lot of the combinatorial and simulation problems in the world are so difficult, have so many variables, that we have to oversimplify them in order to get them to work. This is very true in finance, for example. So with quantum computers, we can actually solve them the right way. We can solve them in either a faster way, in a more accurate way, or in a cheaper way. Are we there yet? No. We do have quantum devices today. They don't have that many qubits. The qubits that we have are full of errors. But at the moment, it's not a physics problem anymore. There's a lot of physics to develop, but it's more an engineering problem or an engineering challenge on how do we scale these quantum devices, how do we create error correcting codes that fix the errors faster than they happen, and then we deliver the use cases. So in a way, it's a technology that's helping us going into the absolute edge of what is possible. Now, I was very happily doing research and analyzing on all that, and then there was this company that no one knew about them that released something called GPT-2. Of course, this was a few years after the paper Attention is all you need, and suddenly the machine learning and AI world was not boring anymore. And then I got dragged back into the world of AI, and now I am sort of balancing my time between the two technologies. But I really believe that quantum is sort of the next stage after AI, and there are obviously a lot of hybrid possibilities between the two worlds. It's complex. It is very difficult to understand, but incredibly rewarding.
I was realizing before talking to you that quantum computing, even if it's one of my favorite topics as a personal thing, never really came up in this podcast before. So I was actually excited to have this conversation with you, Sergio. Exactly.
We can always do a one session fully on quantum.
Yeah, we might probably need to go down that route soon and having a single session on quantum computing. But I really wanted to talk first about your book today. But on the other hand, I could not resist not to ask you about that, because it's definitely a joint passion, and also an area where we managed to find ourselves in conferences and things like that, and have sort of common acquaintances. Yeah, there is definitely much more to dive down. One other topic, one reflection I had, and also trying to compare, sort of before closing, comparing AI and quantum. There is definitely an element where you can see also from a point of view of VC and fund landscape, where the next step is of course there is a lot of investment and growth on AI, but you can see that the next breakthrough, if you really want to keep this growth, is on the hardware side of things, is really on the tangible thing. And I think that's particularly valuable for quantum computing. As you just mentioned, it's a technology that can unlock the way we basically build everything else in our civilization. And I think if it can keep the promise, or even half the promise, is going to revolutionize everything we do. And I can think about space exploration, energy production. Everything is going to change, because material are going to be production and design. Actually, design and production is going to change so much. So yeah, it's definitely an exciting place, and probably yes, I will most likely take your offer for a dedicated episode only on quantum computing. Said that, conscious of time, let's move it to, unless, of course, we still have the option, as you said, of a 5 hours episode today, but maybe we don't want to
put the audience with.
We want to kill our audience, not yet, at least with such long endurance episode. Let's move to the last question. It's a question that I ask all my guests, and I think it's particularly relevant from your perspective, from the book you've written, but again, especially your view, your very broad view you have on these deep technologies like generative AI and quantum technologies. And the question is, what are the key characteristics of a leader who embraces complexity for you?
It's an incredibly difficult question, but at the same time I think embracing complexity is precisely what defines a leader per se, right? So on one hand, and we talked about this, how can you make decisions with little information and live with those decisions and face the consequences of those decisions? How can you convince people and lead them towards the ways of simplifying this system? And how can you translate complex concepts, whether it is complex problem formulation, complex technology architecture, complex things like quantum computing? How do you translate that into actionable items that people can relate to? Put all that together in a box, and it's almost like a sales playbook. But at the end of the day, as a leader, you're selling to your team some company goals, some objectives, some way of working. You're selling to your investors or to your CEO a specific strategy, whether it's technology strategy or not. You're selling your company to investors. So you need complexity because we live in a complex world. But how do you bring that down, bring that entropy down through communication, through explaining, through being the right time at the right moment and giving them the right words that they need at a time? I think those could be the main skills. And then being human, being good with people, trusting them, they will trust you.
I think your answer was great, and I love asking this question because I get so much different answers.
Yeah.
And so inspiring, and you can really kind of get out of each single guest what sort of they're really thinking from their own style, the way they want to lead and the way they want to sort of push others. And I like this sales analogy a lot. It makes a lot of sense and it's definitely unique. So thanks a lot for being here. You already promised a follow-up on quantum computing, so I'll definitely take on that. But this conversation was great. Thanks for spending the time with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And thank you, Christine, for inviting me.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.